What if the military strategy that defined America's approach to Cold War conflicts was based on a fundamental miscalculation? What if the general, who was publicly humiliated and dismissed in disgrace, had actually understood the future of warfare better than the men who replaced him? In April 1951, General Omar Bradley stood before Congress and delivered one of the most consequential statements in American military history. Speaking about General Douglas MacArthur's proposed strategy to expand the Korean War into China, Bradley declared it would involve the United States in the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. These words became the epitaph for MacArthur's career and the foundation for decades of American military doctrine. Yet in the years that followed, as America stumbled through Vietnam and confronted the true nature of communist expansion, some of those same generals who had opposed MacArthur began to wonder if they had made a catastrophic error in judgment. This is the story of a strategic clash that transcended personal rivalries and political maneuvering. It is the story of two fundamentally different visions of how America should wage war in the atomic age, and how the choice between them would echo through decades of conflict, costing hundreds of thousands of lives and reshaping the global balance of power. At its heart lies a question that remains disturbingly relevant today. When fighting a limited war, can a democracy ever truly win, or does it merely delay an inevitable reckoning? Douglas MacArthur was born on January 26, 1880, into a military dynasty that epitomized American martial excellence. His father, Arthur MacArthur Jr., had won the Medal of Honor during the Civil War and later served as military governor of the Philippines. Young Douglas absorbed the art of war like other children absorbed nursery rhymes, and he would graduate from West Point in 1903 with the highest academic record in 25 years. By the time he was 50, he had already become the youngest general in the American Army, a hero of World War I, whose boldness in combat had become legendary. Omar Nelson Bradley presented a stark contrast to MacArthur's aristocratic bearing. Born February 12, 1893 in rural Missouri, Bradley embodied the steady competence of Middle America. Where MacArthur courted publicity and crafted an image of martial grandeur, Bradley became known as the GI General, a methodical planner who earned respect through reliability rather than brilliance. He graduated from West Point in 1915, the same class that produced Dwight Eisenhower, and built his reputation through careful competence rather than flashy heroics. By June 1950, when North Korean forces crashed across the 38th parallel into South Korea, these two men occupied positions that reflected their divergent paths to power. MacArthur, at 70, served as Supreme Commander of Allied powers in Japan and Commander-in-Chief of United Nations forces, ruling his domain like a proconsul from another age. Bradley had risen to become Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest military position in the United States, where he represented the new generation of military managers who approached war as a problem of logistics and resource allocation. The Korean War began as a relatively straightforward case of communist aggression. North Korean forces, equipped with Soviet tanks and artillery, initially overwhelmed the surprised and under-equipped South Korean army and the hastily deployed American units sent to stop them. MacArthur's brilliant amphibious assault at Incheon in September 1950 reversed the tide dramatically, cutting North Korean supply lines and allowing United Nations forces to recapture Seoul and push northward toward the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China. It was in the flush of this triumph that the fundamental strategic disagreement emerged. MacArthur believed the opportunity existed not merely to restore the status quo in Korea, but to strike a decisive blow against communist expansion in Asia. He advocated for extending the war into China itself, proposing to bomb Chinese bases in Manchuria, blockade the Chinese coast, and potentially use nationalist Chinese forces from Taiwan to open a second front on the mainland. In MacArthur's conception, Korea represented not an isolated conflict, but a theater in a larger struggle where the United States could demonstrate that communist aggression would be met with overwhelming force. Bradley and the Joint Chiefs held a radically different view. They saw Korea as a dangerous diversion from the real threat, which they believed lay in Europe, where Soviet forces vastly outnumbered NATO armies. They worried that MacArthur's proposed expansion would trigger World War III, potentially bringing the Soviet Union into the conflict, while America's military strength remained dispersed across the Pacific. Most fundamentally, They questioned whether the complete defeat of communism in Asia justified the risk of nuclear war with the Soviet Union. This disagreement might have remained an internal military debate had MacArthur not repeatedly challenged civilian authority. When President Harry Truman restricted operations to the Korean Peninsula and sought a negotiated settlement, MacArthur openly criticized these limitations in letters to Republican congressmen and in statements to the press. He argued that in war, there was no substitute for victory, and that limiting military operations for political considerations represented a betrayal of the men fighting and dying in Korea's frozen valleys. On April 11, 1951, President Truman made the momentous decision to relieve MacArthur of all his commands. The announcement shocked the nation. MacArthur had become one of the most celebrated military figures in American history, the hero of the Pacific War, who had accepted Japan's surrender aboard the USS Missouri. Now he returned home not in triumph, but in disgrace, dismissed for insubordination by a president whose approval ratings had plummeted to record lows. MacArthur's return to the United States triggered an unprecedented outpouring of public emotion. Millions lined parade routes to see him. He addressed a joint session of Congress on April 19, 1951, delivering his famous "Old Soldiers Never Die" speech that left many representatives in tears. Yet even as the public rallied to MacArthur, the machinery of official Washington prepared to discredit his strategic vision definitively. The Senate Armed Services Committee convened hearings that would stretch across 7 weeks, calling both MacArthur and his critics to testify. These hearings represented far more than a political spectacle. They became a profound national debate about the nature of war, the limits of military power, and America's role in a world divided between nuclear superpowers. The testimony filled over 2 million words and exposed fundamental divisions within America's military and political leadership about how to confront the communist threat. To understand why Bradley and MacArthur reached such different conclusions about how America should wage war, one must understand how their experiences had shaped their strategic thinking. The crucible of World War II had forged both men, but it had taught them radically different lessons. MacArthur had spent World War II conducting a campaign of island hopping across the Pacific, pushing back Japanese forces through a combination of bold amphibious assaults and tactical brilliance. His approach emphasized momentum and the psychological impact of decisive victories. He had promised to return to the Philippines, and he had kept that promise, liberating the islands at tremendous cost because he believed American honor demanded it. For MacArthur, war remained ultimately a contest of wills, and victory went to those who demonstrated the greater resolve. His experience in the Pacific had also given him a particular view of Asian geopolitics. MacArthur had ruled occupied Japan with unprecedented authority, overseeing its transformation from militaristic empire to democratic ally. He believed he understood Asian cultures and communist tactics in ways that Washington bureaucrats could never grasp. When Chinese forces intervened in Korea in late 1950, catching UN forces by surprise and pushing them back in chaotic retreat, MacArthur saw confirmation that the communist powers would only respect force. Half measures and defensive strategies would simply encourage further aggression. The Chinese intervention had been devastating in its suddenness and scale. In late November 1950, as UN forces pushed toward the Yalu River and MacArthur confidently predicted the war would be over by Christmas, hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers poured across the border. They attacked at night, using tactics that exploited weaknesses in UN dispositions, encircling and overwhelming isolated units. The result was one of the worst defeats in American military history, a chaotic retreat that saw entire divisions nearly destroyed and thousands of soldiers killed, wounded, or captured in the frozen Korean mountains. For MacArthur, this disaster vindicated his warnings that China would intervene and demonstrated the folly of fighting with restrictions that allowed the enemy to operate from sanctuary. He had wanted to bomb the bridges across the Yalu River before Chinese forces could cross in strength, but had been denied permission by Washington, which feared such attacks would trigger wider war. Now, with UN forces in full retreat and the entire Korean peninsula potentially lost, MacArthur believed the time had come to strike back decisively against China itself. Bradley's World War II experience had been fundamentally different. He had commanded ground forces in the European theater, coordinating massive armies in campaigns that required meticulous planning and coordination. The invasion of Normandy, the breakout from the hedgerows of France, and the final push into Germany had all demanded the ability to manage enormous logistical complexities while balancing the demands of Allied politics. Bradley had learned that modern war was as much about industrial capacity and careful resource management as it was about battlefield heroics. The European campaign had also taught Bradley the importance of coalition warfare. The defeat of Nazi Germany had required close coordination with British forces, careful diplomacy with the Soviet Union, despite ideological differences, and constant attention to political considerations that shaped military operations. Bradley had seen how Eisenhower's ability to balance military necessity with political reality had been essential to Allied victory. He had learned that in modern warfare, purely military considerations could never be divorced from political context. More importantly, Bradley had been shaped by the emerging realities of the nuclear age. The atomic bomb had been used just as World War II was ending, and by 1950, both the United States and the Soviet Union possessed nuclear weapons. This fact transformed strategic calculus in ways that MacArthur, in Bradley's view, failed to appreciate. A conventional war that escalated into direct confrontation between nuclear powers could end human civilization. The risks of MacArthur's aggressive approach no longer involved just battlefield casualties, but potentially the destruction of American cities. The institutional culture each man inhabited further reinforced these differences. MacArthur, despite holding the title of United Nations Commander, operated with a degree of independence that was increasingly anachronistic in modern military structures. He communicated directly with conservative political leaders in Washington, crafted his own public relations strategy, and saw himself as accountable primarily to history rather than to temporary political authorities. His headquarters in Tokyo had become almost a separate government, making decisions about occupation policy in Japan and military strategy in Korea with minimal interference from Washington. This independence had served MacArthur well during World War II, when communications with Washington were slow and theater commanders necessarily exercised broad discretion. But by 1950, technology had changed. Decisions made in Korea could be communicated to Washington instantly, and the consequences of military actions in Asia could affect American interests globally with unprecedented speed. The idea that a theater commander should enjoy quasi-independent authority to make decisions that might trigger World War struck Bradley and the Joint Chiefs as dangerously outdated. Bradley, in contrast, had risen within a military structure that increasingly valued conformity with civilian leadership. As chairman of the Joint Chiefs, he served at the pleasure of the president and understood his role as providing military advice within the framework of civilian policy objectives. The emerging national security state, with its complex interagency processes and emphasis on coordination, suited Bradley's methodical temperament far better than it suited MacArthur's imperious independence. These different institutional positions reflected deeper philosophical divides about the nature of war itself. MacArthur remained, at heart, a 19th century warrior who believed in decisive battle and total victory. His military hero was Napoleon, who had won campaigns through bold maneuver and the willingness to stake everything on a single decisive engagement. In MacArthur's worldview, the purpose of war was to destroy the enemy's capacity and will to fight using whatever means proved necessary. Bradley represented a newer philosophy of limited war that was emerging in response to nuclear weapons. This philosophy held that war had become too dangerous to wage in the old fashion, that conflicts must be carefully calibrated to achieve specific political objectives without triggering catastrophic escalation. Victory in this conception no longer meant the complete destruction of the enemy, but rather achieving limited political goals at acceptable cost. The personal relationship between MacArthur and Bradley had never been warm, though they maintained professional courtesy. MacArthur viewed Bradley as a competent but unimaginative officer who had benefited from Eisenhower's patronage rather than earned his position through martial brilliance. Bradley saw MacArthur as a brilliant but dangerously egotistical commander whose theatrical personality and political connections had allowed him to operate with insufficient oversight. These personal tensions, while subordinate to genuine strategic disagreements, added emotional intensity to their clash. The clash between these two philosophies came to a head during Senate hearings in May and June 1951. MacArthur testified first, laying out his case for an expanded war with passionate conviction. He argued that the restrictions placed on military operations in Korea made victory impossible, condemned American soldiers to fight and die while denied the means to win decisively. He warned that failure to confront communist aggression in Asia would only encourage Soviet adventurism elsewhere. His testimony was powerful, moving, and seemed to many observers to be irrefutable. Then came Bradley's turn. In his testimony on May 15, 1951, Bradley systematically dismantled MacArthur's strategic logic. He explained that bombing Manchuria would likely bring the Soviet Union into the war directly, triggering a global conflict that America was unprepared to fight. He noted that expanding the war into China would require diverting forces from Europe, where the real strategic threat lay. And then he delivered the phrase that would define the debate. MacArthur's strategy would involve America in the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. The logic behind Bradley's statement rested on several assumptions. First, he argued that the Soviet Union, not China, represented the primary threat to American security. Any war with China would serve Soviet interests by depleting American strength while keeping Soviet forces intact. Second, Bradley believed that Europe, not Asia, was the critical theater where any global conflict would be decided. If the Soviets chose to invade Western Europe while American forces were bogged down fighting China, the consequences would be catastrophic. Third, Bradley worried that MacArthur's proposed expansion would alienate America's allies, who were already nervous about American bellicosity in Asia. The hearings also revealed how differently the two generals assessed risk. MacArthur consistently downplayed the danger of Soviet intervention, arguing that Stalin was too cautious to risk direct confrontation with American military power. He pointed out that the Soviets had not intervened despite having opportunities to do so, suggesting their reluctance to escalate was greater than Washington feared. Bradley, conversely, believed Soviet intentions were unpredictable and that any action that might trigger Soviet entry into the war represented an unacceptable gamble. At the heart of this strategic disagreement lay a fundamental question about the nature of limited war in the nuclear age. Could a democracy effectively wage a limited war, accepting casualties and frustration, while deliberately restraining military power to avoid escalation? Or did such restraint simply condemn nations to prolonged conflicts that sapped public will, while failing to achieve meaningful strategic objectives? MacArthur's position rested on the conviction that limited war was a dangerous illusion. He believed that once committed to combat, a nation must fight with all available means to achieve victory as quickly as possible. To do otherwise was to sacrifice soldiers' lives for no purpose, to drain national resources without accomplishing strategic goals. He saw the concept of limited war as a political construct that ignored military reality and the nature of conflict itself. This view had deep roots in American military tradition. The United States had historically approached war as an aberration, something to be concluded quickly and decisively so the nation could return to peaceful pursuits. The American way of war emphasized overwhelming force, rapid mobilization, and total victory, followed by demobilization. The idea of fighting indefinitely while accepting stalemate ran counter to these traditions and, MacArthur believed, to common sense. In MacArthur's conception, the very notion of limited war represented a fundamental misunderstanding of warfare's essential nature. War was inherently an unlimited phenomenon, a clash of wills where each side sought to impose its vision through violence. Attempting to limit war through arbitrary restrictions on weapons, targets, or geography was like trying to have a controlled forest fire. Once war began, its logic drove toward escalation and totality, regardless of political leaders' wishes to contain it. Bradley and the Joint Chiefs represented a newer strategic paradigm that accepted limited war as an unfortunate necessity of the nuclear age. They argued that in a world where both superpowers possessed weapons capable of destroying civilization, limited conflicts were preferable to total war, even if such limitations proved frustrating. They believed that demonstrating restraint while still resisting aggression would eventually convince the communist powers that expansion was futile without triggering Armageddon. This philosophy drew on emerging theories of deterrence and containment. George Kennan's famous Long Telegram of 1946 had argued that the Soviet Union would eventually collapse from internal contradictions if the West could contain its expansion without triggering a catastrophic war. This containment strategy required accepting frustration and occasional setbacks, while maintaining a defensive perimeter around the communist bloc. Limited wars like Korea were seen as unfortunate but necessary tests of will, demonstrations that aggression would be resisted without necessarily being punished with total war. The containment doctrine represented a radical departure from traditional American strategic thinking. Instead of seeking decisive victory, containment aimed to frustrate enemy expansion over decades, trusting that time favored the economically superior West. This required patience and tolerance for ambiguity that ran counter to American cultural preferences for clear outcomes and rapid resolution. It meant accepting that some conflicts might never be decisively won, but merely managed indefinitely. The question of nuclear weapons loomed over the entire debate in ways both spoken and unspoken. MacArthur had publicly suggested that nuclear weapons might be used against Chinese forces or to create a radioactive barrier along the Yalu River. His willingness to contemplate nuclear escalation horrified many in Washington, who feared it would lead inexorably to Soviet nuclear retaliation against American cities or allies. Yet MacArthur's defenders argued that nuclear weapons actually supported his strategic logic rather than contradicting it. If the United States demonstrated willingness to use overwhelming force, including nuclear weapons, against communist aggression, would not the Soviets be deterred from intervention? The whole point of possessing nuclear weapons in this view was to make their use credible enough that they never actually had to be employed. By treating nuclear weapons as unusable, American leaders were surrendering their deterrent value and encouraging communist adventurism. This argument rested on assumptions about rational deterrence that subsequent decades would prove problematic. MacArthur assumed that demonstrating resolve through escalation would convince adversaries to back down, but this logic ignored the possibility that both sides might escalate simultaneously, each convinced that backing down would signal fatal weakness. The nuclear arms race of subsequent decades would demonstrate that deterrence was far more complex than simply showing willingness to use force. Bradley and the Joint Chiefs rejected this logic as dangerously reckless. They pointed out that the Soviet Union also possessed nuclear weapons and would likely respond to American nuclear use with nuclear attacks of their own. The result would be escalation spiraling toward mutual destruction, with both sides suffering catastrophic casualties that would dwarf anything achieved in previous wars. The whole point of limited war doctrine was to prevent precisely this kind of uncontrollable escalation. The debate over nuclear weapons also revealed different assumptions about how technological change had transformed warfare. MacArthur, despite his tactical innovations in the Pacific, remained conceptually rooted in pre-nuclear strategic thinking. He saw nuclear weapons as simply more powerful bombs, useful tools in the military arsenal, but not fundamentally different from conventional explosives. Bradley and younger strategic thinkers recognized that nuclear weapons represented a qualitative difference that demanded entirely new strategic frameworks. Beyond the immediate question of Korea lay deeper disagreements about the nature of the communist threat and how to confront it. MacArthur viewed international communism as a monolithic force directed from Moscow, requiring a unified Western response that confronted it wherever it appeared. He believed that failing to resist communist aggression in Asia would encourage Soviet adventurism elsewhere, creating a domino effect of communist victories that would eventually leave the United States isolated. This domino theory would become orthodoxy in American foreign policy for decades, justifying intervention in Vietnam and elsewhere. Yet it rested on assumptions about communist unity that were already becoming questionable by 1951. Tensions between Stalin and Mao Zedong, while hidden from Western intelligence, were real and growing. The idea that all communist movements took orders from Moscow oversimplified a far more complex reality. Bradley and the administration took a more nuanced view. They recognized that while Moscow directed much communist activity, important differences existed between Soviet and Chinese interests and between the communist movements in different countries. They believed that treating all communist movements as identical would push them together, whereas careful diplomacy might exploit natural tensions within the communist bloc. This analysis would prove remarkably prescient in the long run, as the Sino-Soviet split of the 1960s demonstrated, but in 1951 it appeared to many as wishful thinking. The debate also raised profound questions about civil-military relations in a democracy. MacArthur's repeated challenges to civilian authority struck Bradley and others as fundamentally threatening to constitutional governance. In their view, the military must remain subordinate to civilian leadership, even when soldiers disagreed with strategic decisions. To allow generals to publicly oppose presidential policy would undermine the entire structure of democratic governance and set a precedent that could lead to military domination of political processes. The principle of civilian control over the military was enshrined in the Constitution, with the president serving as commander-in-chief. Yet this principle had always existed in tension with the reality that military professionals possessed expertise that civilian leaders lacked. Finding the right balance between respecting military expertise and maintaining civilian supremacy had challenged every American administration, and MacArthur's defiance brought this tension into sharp focus. MacArthur's defenders countered that military leaders had an obligation to speak truth to power, especially when they believed civilian policies were needlessly costing soldiers' lives. They argued that the president's role as commander-in-chief did not absolve him of responsibility for listening to military advice, and that when such advice was systematically ignored, military leaders had an obligation to take their case to the public and to Congress. In MacArthur's view, he was defending the constitutional system by ensuring that military expertise informed strategic decisions rather than being subordinated to political expediency. This tension between military expertise and civilian control had no easy resolution. Democratic governance required civilian supremacy over military affairs, yet wars were ultimately won or lost based on military realities that politicians might not fully grasp. Finding the right balance between these imperatives remained one of the fundamental challenges of democratic statecraft, and the MacArthur-Bradley clash brought it into sharp relief. The question of public opinion further complicated the debate. MacArthur enjoyed enormous public support, with polls showing that most Americans sympathized with his frustration over fighting restrictions. Bradley and Truman faced the challenge of maintaining an unpopular policy against a popular general, demonstrating the difficulties democracies face when fighting limited wars. How could leaders sustain public support for conflicts that produced frustration rather than victory? This question would haunt American policymakers for decades to come. MacArthur's strategic vision for Korea, though ultimately rejected, represented a coherent if controversial approach to the challenge of communist expansion. He proposed a four-part strategy that he believed would resolve the Korean conflict decisively while delivering a severe blow to communist prestige throughout Asia. First, he advocated for intensive bombing of Chinese military installations and supply bases in Manchuria. MacArthur argued that allowing Chinese forces to operate from sanctuary bases across the Yalu River while restricting UN forces to Korean territory created an impossible military situation. Bombing these bases would disrupt Chinese supply lines and command and control capabilities, potentially forcing a Chinese withdrawal from Korea without requiring ground operations in China itself. MacArthur envisioned a systematic campaign that would target not just military installations, but also the transportation infrastructure supporting Chinese operations in Korea. Railway yards, bridges, ammunition depots, and troop concentration areas would all be struck from the air, leveraging American air superiority to impose costs on China that would make continued intervention unsustainable. He argued that modern air power made such campaigns feasible without requiring ground forces to cross into Chinese territory. Second, MacArthur proposed a naval blockade of the Chinese coast. Such a blockade would strangle China's limited maritime commerce and demonstrate American resolve to confront Chinese intervention seriously. More importantly, it would apply economic pressure without requiring massive ground forces, leveraging American naval supremacy to create strategic effects disproportionate to the resources committed. The blockade would not only interdict military supplies, but also civilian trade, gradually tightening economic pressure on China's already strained economy. MacArthur believed that China, still recovering from years of civil war and struggling to industrialize, could not sustain both a major military commitment in Korea and significant economic disruption from a naval blockade. The cumulative effect would force Chinese leaders to reconsider their intervention. Third, MacArthur wanted to utilize nationalist Chinese forces from Taiwan for diversionary operations against the Chinese mainland. These forces, numbering several 100,000 troops, were eager to return to the mainland and could open a second front that would force Chinese forces to withdraw divisions from Korea to defend vulnerable coastal areas. This would achieve strategic effects without requiring additional American ground forces. Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces, though defeated in the Chinese Civil War, remained substantial and motivated. MacArthur envisioned using them for raids and potentially larger operations along China's southern coast, forcing the communist government to disperse forces defending against multiple threats. Even if these operations achieved limited territorial gains, they would serve the strategic purpose of drawing Chinese attention and resources away from Korea. Fourth, and most controversially, MacArthur suggested that nuclear weapons be considered among the options available to UN commanders. He proposed using tactical nuclear weapons to destroy Chinese concentrations in Korea or to create a radioactive barrier along the Yalu River that would prevent Chinese reinforcement. While he never insisted on using nuclear weapons, he believed that removing them from consideration arbitrarily surrendered a significant military advantage. MacArthur envisioned nuclear weapons as essentially powerful conventional bombs, rather than as weapons of mass destruction requiring special moral consideration. He believed that using them against military targets in sparsely populated areas would be no different ethically than using conventional bombs, but would be far more effective militarily. The radioactive barrier concept particularly appealed to him as a way to seal the Korean border without requiring large ground forces. Together, these proposals represented MacArthur's vision of how to fight a limited war effectively. He accepted that direct invasion of China was neither necessary nor desirable, but he rejected the notion that fighting a limited war required accepting artificial restrictions on military operations. In his conception, limited war meant limiting political objectives, not military means. The goal was to drive Chinese forces from Korea and demonstrate that aggression carried unacceptable costs, not to occupy China or overthrow its government. MacArthur also believed his strategy offered a path to ending the war quickly, which would ultimately save lives compared to prolonged stalemate. He pointed to the experience of World War II, where overwhelming force applied decisively had ended the war far more quickly than gradualist approaches would have done. Every month the war continued meant thousands more casualties, billions more dollars spent, and increasing war weariness among the American public. Swift, decisive action, though risky, offered the possibility of ending the conflict before it could metastasize into something worse. The economic logic of MacArthur's approach deserves examination. He argued that the cost of an expanded war, while substantial, would be less than the cumulative cost of years of stalemate. The Korean War was already consuming enormous resources, requiring the maintenance of large forces in a theater far from American shores. If aggressive action could end the war within months rather than years, the total expenditure would be lower and the economic disruption less severe. Bradley and the Joint Chiefs, after carefully analyzing MacArthur's proposals, concluded that each element carried risks that outweighed potential benefits. Bombing Manchuria would likely trigger Soviet intervention, as the Soviet Union had signed a mutual defense treaty with China and had already deployed Air Force units to Chinese bases. Soviet entry into the war would transform a regional conflict into a global one, potentially bringing Soviet bomber attacks on Japan, where American bases and hundreds of thousands of American military personnel were located. The intelligence available to Bradley suggested that Soviet forces in the Far East were substantial and well-positioned to intervene in Korea. Soviet air bases in Siberia could launch strikes against American forces throughout the region. Soviet submarine forces could threaten American supply lines across the Pacific. Most alarmingly, Soviet forces could attack American bases in Japan, potentially triggering a wider Pacific War that would require enormous resources to fight. The naval blockade proposal faced similar objections. China's economy in 1950 was largely agrarian and self-sufficient, so a naval blockade would have limited immediate impact. More importantly, enforcing such a blockade would require American naval forces to engage Chinese coastal batteries and potentially Chinese submarines provided by the Soviet Union. Each engagement carried the risk of escalation and would certainly alienate America's allies, particularly Britain, which maintained important commercial ties with China. British opposition to expanding the war was particularly problematic for American strategy. Britain was America's most important ally, and British forces were fighting alongside American troops in Korea. If aggressive American actions alienated Britain, it could fracture the Western alliance at a critical moment. Britain also had colonial possessions in Asia that would be vulnerable to communist pressure if relations with China deteriorated further. Using nationalist Chinese forces presented both military and political problems. Militarily, the Joint Chiefs doubted these forces' effectiveness, noting that they had been defeated by communist forces in the Chinese Civil War just 2 years earlier. Politically, involving nationalist forces would make any negotiated settlement impossible, as the Chinese government would view it as an existential threat requiring unlimited commitment to the war. It would also antagonize America's allies, many of whom had recognized the communist government as China's legitimate ruler. The question of nationalist Chinese military effectiveness was particularly vexing. These forces had collapsed rapidly during the Chinese Civil War, plagued by corruption, poor leadership, and low morale. While safe on Taiwan, they had begun rebuilding, but whether they could effectively fight against battle-hardened communist forces remained doubtful. Using them might simply provide Chinese forces with easy victories that would boost communist morale. The nuclear question raised the most profound concerns. Any use of nuclear weapons against Chinese forces would establish a precedent that these weapons were appropriate for conventional conflicts, potentially leading to their use by the Soviet Union in Europe or elsewhere. It would also generate enormous international condemnation, alienating even close allies and providing Soviet propaganda with powerful material. Most fundamentally, it could trigger Soviet nuclear retaliation, either in Asia or against American allies in Europe, initiating the very nuclear war that limited war doctrine sought to prevent. The moral and political implications of using nuclear weapons had become clearer since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those bombings had ended World War II, but had also created revulsion at the weapon's destructive power. Using nuclear weapons against Chinese forces would be seen by much of the world as disproportionate and barbaric, undermining America's moral standing and providing communist propaganda with powerful ammunition. Bradley's alternative strategy accepted that Korea would be a frustrating, protracted conflict, but argued this frustration was preferable to the risks of escalation. The United States would continue fighting in Korea to demonstrate that aggression would be resisted, while simultaneously building up conventional forces in Europe to deter Soviet adventurism. Eventually, the communist powers would recognize that expansion was futile and accept a negotiated settlement that preserved South Korean independence. This strategy rested on several assumptions. First, it presumed that the Soviet Union was rational and would not risk nuclear war over Korea. Second, it assumed that American public opinion would tolerate a prolonged, limited war if political leaders explained its necessity. Third, it depended on America's allies supporting this approach rather than seeking accommodation with communist powers. And fourth, it required faith that the economic and political advantages of the Western system would eventually prevail over communist alternatives, making containment sustainable over the long term. The assumption about American public opinion would prove particularly problematic. Democracies had historically struggled to sustain support for wars that produced frustration rather than clear progress toward victory. The challenge facing American leaders was to maintain public support for a conflict where success meant simply preventing defeat rather than achieving triumph. This would require a level of public education and patience that proved difficult to sustain. In the immediate aftermath of the MacArthur-Bradley confrontation, the conventional wisdom held that Bradley had been vindicated. MacArthur's proposals were deemed reckless, his dismissal necessary to preserve civilian control of the military. The Korean War ground on for 2 more years before ending in an armistice that essentially restored the pre-war status quo. MacArthur faded from public life, though he remained a revered figure among conservatives who believed his strategic vision had been wrongly rejected. Yet as the years passed and America confronted new challenges in Asia, doubts began to emerge about the wisdom of the limited war doctrine that had triumphed in 1951. Vietnam would provide the most devastating test of these ideas, and the results would force a reconsideration of assumptions that had seemed unquestionable during the Korean War. The Vietnam War began with the same logic that had governed Korea. America would resist communist aggression through limited military intervention, carefully calibrating force to achieve political objectives without triggering wider conflict. Operations would be restricted to South Vietnam, with North Vietnam treated as a sanctuary except for carefully controlled bombing campaigns. Ground forces would be deployed incrementally, with each escalation carefully calibrated to send signals about American resolve without provoking Chinese or Soviet intervention. The parallels between Korea and Vietnam were striking and ominous. In both conflicts, American forces fought with restrictions designed to prevent escalation. In both, enemy forces enjoyed sanctuaries across borders that could not be attacked effectively. In both, the American public grew increasingly frustrated with conflicts that seemed to drag on indefinitely without clear progress. And in both, military leaders chafed at restrictions they believed made victory impossible. This approach produced a disaster that exceeded even the worst-case scenarios MacArthur had predicted for limited war doctrine. American forces fought with one hand tied behind their back, unable to attack enemy sanctuaries in Cambodia, Laos, and North Vietnam effectively, unable to interdict supply lines without risking Chinese intervention. The war dragged on for over a decade, costing 58,000 American lives and shattering domestic political consensus. In the end, America withdrew without achieving its objectives, and within 2 years, South Vietnam fell to communist forces. The failure in Vietnam was multifaceted, involving problems of strategy, tactics, and political will, but at its core was the same fundamental dilemma MacArthur had identified in Korea. Could limited war doctrine actually work in practice, or did it simply condemn forces to fight indefinitely without prospect of victory? Vietnam seemed to validate MacArthur's warning that accepting artificial restrictions on military operations made success impossible. As former military leaders reflected on Vietnam, some began to acknowledge that MacArthur had identified real problems with limited war doctrine that had never been adequately resolved. General Matthew Ridgway, who had replaced MacArthur in Korea and initially supported the administration's approach, later wrote that the United States had failed to learn crucial lessons about the difficulties of fighting limited wars. He argued that if a war was worth fighting, it was worth fighting to win, and that accepting stalemate simply condemned soldiers to die for no clear purpose. Ridgway's evolution was particularly significant because he had been one of the generals who executed the limited war strategy in Korea successfully after MacArthur's dismissal. He had stabilized the front, rebuilt American forces' combat effectiveness, and fought the Chinese to a standstill. Yet even with this experience, he came to believe that the fundamental problems MacArthur had identified remained unresolved. General Curtis LeMay, who had commanded Strategic Air Command during Korea, became even more explicit in his criticism of limited war doctrine. He argued that politicians who committed forces to combat while imposing arbitrary restrictions on military operations were condemning soldiers to death without giving them the means to achieve victory. LeMay believed that MacArthur had been right to demand that if America was going to fight, it should fight to win decisively, using whatever means proved necessary. LeMay's views were shaped by his experience in World War II, where strategic bombing had contributed decisively to defeating both Germany and Japan. He believed that air power, if used without restriction, could win wars quickly and decisively. The refusal to use air power effectively in Korea and Vietnam, in his view, represented a failure of political will that needlessly prolonged conflicts and multiplied casualties. Even some of MacArthur's civilian critics began to acknowledge that his concerns about limited war had merit. Dean Acheson, who as Secretary of State had supported MacArthur's dismissal, later wrote that the United States had perhaps been too cautious in Korea, too worried about triggering escalation. He acknowledged that the administration's fear of Soviet intervention had caused them to accept restrictions on military operations that may not have been necessary. Acheson's reconsideration was particularly striking, given his role in formulating the containment strategy that MacArthur had challenged. His willingness to acknowledge potential errors suggested that the debate between MacArthur and Bradley had been less clear-cut than it appeared at the time. Both sides had identified real considerations, and the wisdom of the choices made remained genuinely debatable. The question of whether MacArthur had been right ultimately depended on counterfactual speculation about what would have happened if his strategy had been adopted. Would bombing Chinese bases in Manchuria have triggered Soviet intervention as Bradley feared? Or would it have convinced the Chinese that supporting North Korea was too costly, leading to a swifter end to the conflict? Historians and military analysts have debated these questions ever since, and no consensus has emerged. Some argue that MacArthur's assessment of Soviet intentions was correct, that Stalin was far too cautious to risk direct confrontation with the United States over Korea. They point out that the Soviet Union never intervened directly in the Korean War, despite having the capability to do so, suggesting that Soviet risk aversion was greater than Bradley had estimated. Evidence that emerged after the Cold War suggested that Stalin was indeed extremely cautious about direct confrontation with the United States. Soviet archives revealed that Stalin provided material support to China and North Korea, but consistently avoided actions that might trigger American retaliation against Soviet territory. This suggests MacArthur may have been right that aggressive action would not have provoked Soviet intervention. Others maintain that Bradley's caution was justified, arguing that any expansion of the war carried unpredictable risks that could have led to catastrophe. They note that even without expanding the war, Korea came perilously close to nuclear escalation on several occasions, and that MacArthur's aggressive approach would have made such escalation far more likely. The fact that disaster was avoided does not mean the risks were imaginary. The debate over nuclear weapons remains particularly contentious. MacArthur's willingness to consider using nuclear weapons in Korea seems reckless in retrospect, given what we now know about the dangers of nuclear escalation. Yet his defenders argue that demonstrating willingness to use nuclear weapons might have ended the war more quickly and prevented the prolonged stalemate that ultimately occurred. What seems clearer in retrospect is that both MacArthur and Bradley identified real problems without finding satisfactory solutions. MacArthur was right that limited war doctrine contained inherent contradictions that would prove devastating when applied in Vietnam. Fighting wars while accepting artificial limitations on military operations did condemn soldiers to prolonged conflicts where victory became impossible by definition. The frustration and demoralization this produced would contribute to the decline in American military effectiveness during the Vietnam era. The impact on military morale and effectiveness was profound. Soldiers who fought in Vietnam often expressed frustration at fighting under restrictions that seemed to ensure they could never win. The feeling that political leaders had sent them to fight while denying them the means to succeed contributed to declining discipline, drug use, and the breakdown of unit cohesion that plagued American forces in Vietnam's later years. Yet Bradley was also right that total war between nuclear powers carried risks that transcended any conceivable political objective. The threat of nuclear escalation was real and demanded caution in ways that MacArthur never fully acknowledged. His willingness to consider nuclear weapons in Korea suggested a cavalier attitude toward the most destructive weapons ever created, an attitude that could have led to catastrophe. The deeper problem was that the nuclear age had created a strategic paradox that neither general's approach could resolve. Wars could no longer be fought to total victory without risking total annihilation, yet limited wars proved nearly impossible to win decisively. Democracies required public support to sustain military operations, but limited wars by their nature produced frustration and stalemate that eroded such support over time. Authoritarian regimes could pursue limited wars indefinitely, while democracies faced increasing pressure to either escalate or withdraw. This asymmetry in staying power gave authoritarian regimes a significant advantage in limited wars. They did not need to maintain public support, justify casualties to voters, or face electoral consequences for unsuccessful policies. Democracies faced all these pressures, making prolonged limited wars extremely difficult to sustain, regardless of their strategic importance. Some military historians have argued that the real lesson of the MacArthur-Bradley debate was that America should avoid limited wars entirely, intervening only when prepared to use overwhelming force to achieve complete victory quickly. This Powell Doctrine, articulated by General Colin Powell after the Vietnam War, held that military force should be used only as a last resort, but when used, it should be applied decisively with clear objectives and overwhelming power. The Powell Doctrine represented an attempt to synthesize lessons from both Korea and Vietnam, accepting MacArthur's insight that limited wars were inherently problematic while incorporating Bradley's recognition that not every conflict justified unlimited commitment. By setting high thresholds for military intervention, but demanding overwhelming force once committed, Powell sought to avoid the strategic paralysis that had plagued both earlier conflicts. Others have concluded that limited wars are sometimes unavoidable, and that rather than rejecting limited war doctrine, America needed to develop more sophisticated approaches to waging such conflicts. This perspective emphasized counterinsurgency, nation-building, and winning hearts and minds rather than conventional military operations. The challenge was to find ways to achieve political objectives in limited wars without either escalating to general war or accepting indefinite stalemate. This alternative approach recognized that many modern conflicts were fundamentally political rather than military in nature, requiring political solutions supported by military force rather than military solutions alone. Success required understanding local cultures, building effective indigenous forces, and addressing the political grievances that fueled insurgencies. Purely military approaches of the kind MacArthur advocated would not suffice. The debate also raised troubling questions about civil-military relations that remain unresolved. Was MacArthur right that military leaders have an obligation to speak out publicly when they believe civilian policies are needlessly costing soldiers lives? Or did his challenge to civilian authority represent a dangerous precedent that threatened democratic governance? The tension between military expertise and civilian control continues to surface whenever America contemplates military intervention, with no clear consensus about how to balance these imperatives. Recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan have raised these questions anew. Military commanders have sometimes publicly disagreed with civilian policies, arguing that insufficient forces or inappropriate strategies were undermining mission success. Each time this occurs, the ghost of MacArthur haunts the debate, reminding us that the tension between military expertise and civilian control remains unresolved. On April 11, 1964, exactly 13 years after President Truman had dismissed him from command, General Douglas MacArthur delivered his final public address to the cadets of West Point. He was 84 years old, his once powerful frame diminished by age, but his voice still commanding. He spoke of duty, honor, and country, themes that had defined his long career. He made no mention of Korea or the strategic debates that had ended his military service, but those who heard him understood that he remained unrepentant about the positions he had taken. MacArthur died just a month later, on April 5, 1964, still convinced that history would vindicate his strategic vision. He never lived to see the Vietnam War prove many of his concerns about limited war doctrine tragically prescient. He never witnessed the strategic paralysis that would grip American policymakers as they struggled to find a path between escalation and withdrawal. He never saw another generation of soldiers fight and die in an Asian conflict constrained by political limitations that made victory impossible. His funeral was a state occasion befitting his status as one of America's most celebrated military figures. President Lyndon Johnson attended, as did former Presidents Truman and Eisenhower. Despite their conflicts with MacArthur, the ceremony reflected America's ambivalence about MacArthur himself, admiration for his military genius and service combined with discomfort about his challenge to civilian authority and his strategic vision that had been rejected. Omar Bradley lived longer, dying in 1981 at age 88. By then, the disasters of Vietnam had forced military leaders to confront the contradictions in limited war doctrine that MacArthur had identified 30 years earlier. Bradley watched as the army he had helped build became demoralized and diminished by a conflict that seemed to vindicate everything MacArthur had warned about. In his later years, Bradley spoke less confidently about the wisdom of the decisions made in 1951, acknowledging that the problems MacArthur had identified had never been adequately resolved. Bradley's final years were marked by reflection on his long career and the strategic choices that had defined it. He remained convinced that dismissing MacArthur had been necessary to preserve civilian control of the military, but he acknowledged that the limited war doctrine he had defended contained problems that had not been fully appreciated at the time. Vietnam had demonstrated that fighting wars with political restrictions could be as disastrous as MacArthur had warned. The question of who was right, MacArthur or Bradley, cannot be answered with certainty because we cannot know what would have happened if MacArthur's strategy had been adopted. Would bombing Chinese bases have ended the war quickly, as he believed, or would it have triggered Soviet intervention and escalated into World War III, as Bradley feared? These remain matters of speculation and counterfactual analysis. What we can say with certainty is that both men identified real strategic dilemmas without finding satisfactory solutions. The nuclear age had created a world where total war threatened total annihilation, but where limited wars proved nearly impossible to win decisively. Democracy required public support for sustained military operations, but limited wars generated frustration that eroded such support over time. Military effectiveness demanded clear objectives and the means to achieve them, but political considerations required restraint and acceptance of ambiguous outcomes. The tragic irony is that some of the same generals who had most vehemently opposed MacArthur's strategy in 1951 came to acknowledge after Vietnam that he had identified problems they had failed to address. They had been right about the immediate tactical question of whether to expand the Korean War, but MacArthur had been right about the deeper strategic problem of how democracies could wage limited wars effectively. They had won the battle, but perhaps missed the larger point. Today, as America continues to grapple with how to use military force in a complex world, the MacArthur-Bradley debate remains disturbingly relevant. The specific circumstances have changed, but the fundamental questions persist. When should America intervene militarily in conflicts that do not directly threaten national survival? How can democratic governments sustain support for military operations that produce frustration rather than clear victory? What restrictions on military operations are prudent and which simply condemn soldiers to die without achieving meaningful objectives? Recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan have demonstrated that these questions remain as vexing as ever. Both wars began with clear objectives, but devolved into prolonged counterinsurgencies, where success became difficult to define and victory impossible to achieve decisively. Both generated public frustration and political debates about whether to escalate, withdraw, or muddle through indefinitely. MacArthur's ghost haunted both conflicts, his warnings about limited war echoing across the decades. The tension between MacArthur's instinct for decisive action and Bradley's caution about escalation reflects a deeper tension in American strategic culture that has never been resolved. Americans want their wars to be brief, decisive, and morally unambiguous, fought with overwhelming force to achieve complete victory quickly. Yet the complex reality of modern conflict often requires sustained engagement, tolerance for ambiguity, and acceptance of limited objectives that frustrate the desire for clear triumph. This tension reflects deeper aspects of American political culture. The American system, with its checks and balances and public accountability, is optimized for peace and prosperity, but struggles with the ambiguity and sustained commitment required by limited wars. Authoritarian systems, whatever their other flaws, find it easier to pursue long-term strategies without regard for public opinion or electoral cycles. Perhaps the real lesson of the MacArthur-Bradley debate is not that one general was right and the other wrong, but that they were asking questions that admitted no easy answers. The nuclear age had created strategic paradoxes that no amount of military brilliance could entirely resolve. Wars could no longer be fought the way they had been throughout history. Yet the alternative of limited war proved nearly impossible to prosecute effectively in a democracy. The emergence of nuclear weapons represented a discontinuity in military history as significant as the introduction of gunpowder or the Industrial Revolution. Just as those earlier innovations had required new strategic thinking and new approaches to warfare, nuclear weapons demanded a fundamental reconceptualization of war's purpose and conduct. MacArthur and Bradley were among the first to grapple with this challenge, and neither fully succeeded. In the end, both MacArthur and Bradley were products of their experiences and their era, wrestling with genuinely unprecedented challenges. MacArthur brought the warrior ethos of an earlier age, insisting that if war must be fought, it must be fought to win. Bradley represented the emerging strategic culture of the nuclear age, arguing that caution and restraint were not signs of weakness, but of wisdom. The fact that experienced generals later acknowledged that MacArthur had identified real problems does not necessarily mean his solutions were correct. It means the problems he identified were more profound and enduring than anyone realized at the time. What remains hauntingly true is that the questions MacArthur raised about limited war have never been satisfactorily answered. America spent decades after Vietnam trying to develop better approaches to limited conflicts, but the fundamental tensions remain. The challenge of using military force effectively while avoiding catastrophic escalation, of maintaining democratic support for sustained operations that produce frustration rather than triumph, of balancing military expertise with civilian control continues to plague policymakers. When General Bradley told Congress that MacArthur's strategy would involve America in the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy, he articulated what became conventional wisdom for decades: Yet, as the years passed and America stumbled from one frustrating limited war to another, some began to wonder whether Bradley's formulation had missed something essential. Perhaps there were no right wars in the nuclear age, only impossible choices between risks too terrible to accept and outcomes too frustrating to sustain. The ghost of Douglas MacArthur thus continues to haunt American strategic thinking, not because his specific proposals for Korea were necessarily correct, but because the questions he raised about limited war remain unanswered. Every time America contemplates military intervention in a conflict where vital interests are not directly threatened, every time political leaders impose restrictions on military operations to avoid escalation, every time a limited war drags on inconclusively, MacArthur's warnings echo across the decades. And every time the alternative of aggressive military action threatens escalation to catastrophe, Bradley's caution seems vindicated anew. The truth, uncomfortable as it may be, is that both generals may have been right about different aspects of the problem. MacArthur was right that limited war doctrine contained inherent contradictions that would prove devastating. Bradley was right that the nuclear age demanded restraint and caution that previous generations of military leaders had never needed to exercise. The strategic paradox they confronted has not been resolved but merely managed, awkwardly and imperfectly, through decades of trial and error that have cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Perhaps that is the ultimate lesson of this confrontation between two legendary generals. Sometimes historical dilemmas admit no good solutions, only difficult choices between imperfect alternatives. Sometimes the questions that matter most are precisely those that cannot be answered definitively. And sometimes, as with the debate between MacArthur and Bradley, we are left not with clear vindication of one position over another, but with the sobering recognition that we are still struggling with the same fundamental problems they wrestled with 70 years ago, no closer to resolution than when Bradley stood before Congress and uttered his famous condemnation. The ghosts of MacArthur and Bradley continue their debate in every Pentagon war room, in every congressional hearing on military affairs, and in every difficult decision about when and how America should use military force in a dangerous world. We have learned much since 1951, but we have not yet learned how to escape the strategic paradoxes that ended MacArthur's career and that continue to bedevil American policy to this day. The enduring relevance of their debate suggests that they were grappling with questions that transcend their specific historical moment. How should democracies wage war in an age where technology has made war potentially unlimited in its destructiveness? How can military force serve political objectives when the use of that force risks catastrophic escalation? How can nations demonstrate resolve without triggering the very catastrophe they seek to avoid? These questions remain as relevant today as they were in 1951, and the answers remain as elusive. That, perhaps, is the most disturbing legacy of all. We have not solved the problems MacArthur and Bradley debated. We have merely learned to live with them, accepting strategic frustration and occasional failure as the price of avoiding nuclear catastrophe. Whether this represents wisdom or a failure of imagination, whether future generations will find better answers or simply repeat our mistakes, remains an open question. But as long as nations possess both nuclear weapons and the capacity for conventional warfare, the debate between MacArthur and Bradley will remain relevant, their ghosts continuing to argue over the eternal question of how to wage war in an age when war has become almost too dangerous to wage at all.